The gavel slammed, echoing like a gunshot across the chamber. Judge Samuel Alito leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with the kind of smug confidence that comes from years of unchecked power. His tone dripped with condescension as he spoke. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said slowly, pausing for effect, "perhaps you can explain to this court why your argument ignores the very foundation of constitutional order. Or is it that you simply don't understand it?" Gasps rippled through the room. It wasn't just a question, it was a trap. A calculated attempt to box her in, to paint her as unprepared, unworthy, small. Reporters' pens scratched furiously across notepads, sensing that a headline moment was unfolding before their eyes. Alito smirked, as though the game was already won. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She sat still, her chin slightly lifted, her silence stretching just long enough to unsettle even the judge. The pause was deliberate, powerful, and then she spoke. "Judge Alito," she began, her voice smooth and steady, "the Constitution doesn't fear me, but I think you're afraid of how clearly it speaks when it's not twisted to serve your agenda." The courtroom stirred, a murmur swelling into quiet shock. Alito blinked, his smirk faltering for the briefest second. It was subtle but unmistakable. The trap had not only failed, it had backfired. Crockett leaned forward, her gaze locked on his. "You've built your career pretending to be the guardian of order. But order without justice is nothing but control. And control, Judge, is not the same thing as law." The audience froze. The words cut sharper than any objection, striking at the very heart of his authority. The air was electric. What had begun as a trap now teetered into something else. Something bigger. The room wasn't watching a judge corner a congresswoman. They were watching a congresswoman stare down the highest seat of power and refuse to bend. And the silence that followed carried more weight than his gavel ever could. But what she said next didn't just stop the judge in his tracks, it flipped the entire trial on its head. This wasn't just another tense courtroom exchange. What unfolded between Judge Samuel and Crockett carried stakes far beyond the four walls of that chamber. At its core, it was a clash of two visions of America, one rooted in hierarchy, intimidation, and control, and the other built on dignity, justice, and fearless truth-telling. For years, Alito had cultivated a reputation, the jurist who cloaked partisanship in polished legalese, the judge who never backed down from belittling those who dared to challenge him. His supporters saw him as untouchable, and now across from him sat Crockett, a rising force, known for her unflinching style and refusal to bow to authority when authority was weaponized against the people. Her voice had become a rallying cry for progressives, immigrants, and working families who often felt silenced in rooms just like this one. The stakes weren't just about a legal argument. They were about perception. If Alito succeeded in cornering her, it would reinforce his dominance, judge putting a congresswoman in her place. But if Crockett could hold her ground, if she could turn his trap into a platform, then the imbalance of power itself would be exposed for what it truly was. And that was exactly what the country was watching for. Because this wasn't just Crockett versus Alito. It was dignity versus arrogance, law, as justice versus law as control. And the moment begged the question, who would walk out of that courtroom with the narrative in their hands? The tension was rising. The trap was set. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't about to play by his script to understand why this moment carried so much weight. You have to know who Samuel Alito is, and the shadow he casts over the American legal system. Appointed to the Supreme Court nearly 2 decades ago, Alito built his career as a sharp, calculating conservative voice. He was never the loudest in public, but behind closed doors, his rulings spoke volumes. Again and again, his opinions tilted power toward the wealthy, the powerful, and the entrenched. He wrapped his arguments in constitutional language, but critics knew what it was, a thin veil over deeply partisan leanings. From limiting voting rights to chipping away at reproductive freedoms, Alito's fingerprints were everywhere in the fight to pull America backward. To his supporters, he was a guardian of tradition. To his detractors, he was an architect of control, cloaking bias in legal precedent, bending the Constitution not to protect people but to restrict them. And then came his reputation in the courtroom, arrogant, dismissive, known for cutting off lawyers mid-sentence, for smirking when he thought he'd cornered an opponent. He thrived on the performance of power, wielding his robe like armor, his gavel like a weapon. For years, challengers faltered under that glare. They stumbled when he baited them, tripped when he mocked them, and each time Alito's smirk grew just a little wider. But this time was different. This time, he wasn't facing a nervous attorney or an unsure witness. He was facing Jasmine Crockett, a woman who knew what it meant to stand in hostile rooms and refuse to shrink. And for the first time, Alito's old tricks weren't landing. The stage was set for a confrontation he couldn't control, Jasmine. Crockett didn't walk into that chamber by accident. Her story, her fire, had been forged long before this moment. Born and raised in the South, Crockett grew up in a world where justice often felt like a word, reserved for the privileged. She saw the cracks in the system early on, neighbors struggling against poverty, families fighting for dignity, communities silenced by those in power. But instead of bowing her head, she sharpened her voice. She chose the law, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. Immigrants facing deportation. Workers cheated out of their pay. Her office wasn't glamorous, but it was real. The clients weren't famous, but their stories were raw. And Jasmine Crockett gave them everything she had. That kind of work didn't just win cases. It built resilience. It built clarity. She learned to walk into hostile courtrooms where the odds were stacked and still find a way to cut through. She learned that silence, when used right, could be louder than shouting. And when she entered politics, she carried those lessons with her. On the House floor, she became known for her fiery takedowns of hypocrisy and her refusal to let arrogance go unchecked. To her supporters, she wasn't just another politician. She was a fighter, someone who spoke the language of the people who rarely got a microphone. So when she sat across from Samuel Alito, she didn't see just a judge. She saw another man in power trying to weaponize fear and authority. And she knew exactly how to meet him. Not with bluster, not with panic, but with calm precision. Every battle she had fought before this moment had prepared her for it. Every courtroom, every community meeting, every headline clash had built her for this face-off. And as Alito leaned into his trap, Crockett was ready to flip it back on him. Not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced in rooms like this. 1. The tension in the chamber was thick enough to cut. Judge Alito leaned back slightly, adjusting his glasses, his voice dripping with authority as he pressed again. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said, interrupting her mid-sentence. "Please answer the question directly. If you can't cite precedent, perhaps you're in the wrong place." It was the classic Alito tactic. Cut her off, box her in, and belittle her with the weight of the bench. Reporters scribbled frantically, waiting to see if she would stumble. Some in the gallery shook their heads, convinced the Congresswoman was about to be crushed under the gavel. But Crockett didn't bite. She didn't raise her voice or rush her words. She simply folded her hands on the table and let him talk. Let him reveal the condescension that had long been his weapon. When she finally spoke, her tone was measured, calm, unshaken. "Respectfully, Judge, I don't answer to intimidation. I answer to truth. And if you'd allow me to finish, you might learn that precedent doesn't actually support your claim." A murmur swept the room. Alito's brow furrowed, but she pressed on, her words deliberate, slicing through his interruptions with precision. "You can interrupt me all you want, but interruptions don't erase facts. They only expose fear. And I refuse to mistake your fear for authority. The audience shifted, the balance in the room beginning to tilt. For the first time, it wasn't Alito commanding the pace. It was Crockett. And she was drawing the judge deeper into a confrontation he couldn't control. The escalation wasn't loud. It was surgical. And it was about to detonate. The chamber hung in silence for a beat, the weight of Crockett's words still vibrating through the air. Alito leaned forward, his jaw tight, attempting to reclaim control. Counselor, this is not about fear. It's about the rule of law. If you insist on dragging politics into constitutional matters, then you insult this court. The gavel cracked like thunder. A few gasps echoed from the gallery. This was supposed to be the moment Alito put her back in her place. But Crockett didn't flinch. She reached into her folder, her fingers moving with deliberate calm. Slowly, she lifted a document, the kind of legal text that spoke louder than any gavel. She held it up for the room to see. "This," she declared, her voice carrying like a blade slicing the tension, "is the precedent you claim doesn't exist. Brown v. Board of Education. Loving v. Virginia. Obergefell v. Hodges. Do these sound like politics to you, Judge? Or do they sound like the Constitution evolving? Expanding rights instead of shrinking them?" Her words reverberated, each case name landing like a hammer blow. You sit there pretending the law is static. But history proves otherwise. Every generation has faced those who tried to use the Constitution as a cage instead of a shield. And every generation has had to fight. Fight people who thought like you. A ripple coursed through the crowd. The reporter's pen scratched furiously. The audience leaned forward, pulled by the gravity of her defiance. Alito tried to interject, but Crockett raised her hand. Not rudely, but with the command of someone who owned the floor. "No, Judge, you've had your say. Now the people will have theirs. Because this courtroom doesn't belong to you. It belongs to justice. And justice doesn't flinch when challenged. It rises." The room erupted. Murmurs, applause, energy sparking like live wire. Even those who came in skeptical couldn't deny it. She had landed the mic drop moment, and the look on Alito's face said it all. He hadn't trapped Crockett. She had just flipped the trial. The echoes of Crockett's words didn't stop at the four walls of the courtroom. Within minutes, the clip hit social media and it spread like wildfire. On X, hashtags blazed across trending lists. Crockett flips, the court. Alito exposed, justice rises. Progressive circles erupted with pride. Young activists replayed the moment on loop, cheering as Crockett lifted the Constitution higher than the judge's gavel. Immigrant families, watching from living rooms across the country, saw in her defiance a mirror of their own battles against intimidation and dismissal. "She spoke for us," one viral post read. "For everyone who's ever been silenced, interrupted, or told we don't belong. And for the ordinary viewers, it wasn't about politics at all. It was about watching someone refuse to shrink under power." By the end of the night, millions had seen the exchange. And the question lingered everywhere, from Twitter threads to kitchen tables. The morning after, the weight of Crockett's words settled like a storm cloud over Judge Alito. For years, he had wielded his authority with an air of untouchable power, dismissing critics as fringe voices. But this time was different. This wasn't just a heated exchange buried in transcripts. This was a viral moment broadcast to millions. Editorials rolled out before sunrise. Major papers framed it bluntly. Crockett exposes Alito's bias in stunning. Exchange, opinion columns dissected his every gesture. The furrowed brow, the faltering tone, the desperate gavel. They weren't the expressions of authority. They were the tells of a man cornered. Behind closed doors, allies panicked. Conservative strategists whispered about damage control. urging silence, while others demanded counterattacks against Crockett. But no strategy could erase what millions had already seen, the thin veneer of impartiality cracking in real time. On Capitol Hill, Democratic lawmakers praised Crockett's composure, calling her defense of the Constitution a masterclass in courage. Even moderates, usually cautious with their words, admitted privately that Alito had overplayed his hand. One staffer leaked, he looked less like a judge and more like a politician caught, red-handed, if a single exchange could shake the image of the Supreme. Court's most controversial voice. What would happen when others found their courage to confront him too? And that's when the stakes of this battle became undeniable. In the end, Crockett's confrontation with Judge Alito was more than a fiery exchange in a courtroom. It was a moment that revealed something deeper about who we are as a nation. For decades, power in America has often spoken from the top down. But Crockett flipped that script. She showed that courage, clarity, and conviction can pierce even the highest walls of authority. She reminded us that the Constitution doesn't belong to judges alone. It belongs to the people. Her voice carried the weight of communities too often ignored, dismissed, or talked over. And in that courtroom, when she refused to bow, she wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for every immigrant who fought for a seat at the table, every worker who demanded fairness, every citizen who still believes in justice when the odds seem stacked against them. The moral is clear. Dignity is stronger than arrogance, and justice shines brightest when ordinary people refuse to be intimidated. As viewers, the choice is now ours. Do we stay silent when power abuses its voice? Or do we, like Crockett, raise our own? So if you believe her courage matters, hit subscribe right now, because US only the beginning. Tap the bell so you never miss when arrogance gets called out. And share this video with someone who needs the reminder that justice still speaks. And drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Crockett just set the tone for a new era of accountability? Because your voice, just like hers, can flip the script.